problems today as they were quite a number of years ago now, when this dialogue first took place in around 1972, 1973. So, in a sense, not much progress, you'll find, has been made in terms of the situation in 1972, 73, and the situation now. But there are still burning problems and need to be carefully considered. So the first one, which we're going to in some detail, is the great problem of the mass media. How much freedom, if you like, they deserve, and how much they should be given. What is the ideal? So, of course, it's common knowledge that the mass media is now at work throughout the world, even in the less fortunate countries, what is sometimes called the third world. The mass media is used in order to inform the public, even in quite primitive areas these days. It's a fact, isn't it, that if there is a coup d'etat, nearly always you'll read in the papers that the first place the army of the leader who is trying to seize power goes to is the radio station, television station, because it's such a crucial point of control over the minds of the people. That is what they're thinking, isn't it? And it's true. So this problem of molding or bending the minds of the people through the mass media is the crux of the matter, the crux of the problem. How can we safeguard in a democracy that use of the media in order to pervert or distort the minds of the people? And I think people themselves are probably very sensitive about it, certainly in my generation, because the most incredible classic example in modern times or recent times of the media being used to distort the minds of the people was during the Nazi regime in Germany. The magician in that respect was a man called Goebbels, who was really probably the most important, powerful man at the side of Hitler. He was very intelligent, very warped, and he used the mass media with incredible results. So incredible, I think, that the German people of that generation, let alone later generations, these days can't believe how it was that their minds were so confused and distorted. So he used, of course, in those days, there was no television to speak of. It was press and radio on a mass scale. People of Germany were perfectly ordinary people like us, brought up in a basically, fundamentally Christian culture, like we are, because Christian culture still exists here, doesn't it? People who were leading ordinarily, many of them, what you would term good lives as good citizens. Yet, the vast majority of them, there can be no doubt about that, the vast majority of them were somehow made to accept the Nazi regime and all that it did in terms of imprisonment, torture, slaughter, and racial discrimination. Somehow or other, they were able to turn their heads the other way and still actually support the regime, even though they might deep in their hearts not have agreed in it. Somehow they were made to turn a blind eye on those deep feelings and to act in exactly the way the Nazis wished them to act. Of course, there was a huge element of fear in them doing it in many cases. But in many cases, they really felt, I think, that somehow or other this was the destiny of Germany. And the propaganda was constant, unceasing, and often very clever. So Goebbels played on three, if you like, loopholes in the German mind at that time, which were generally weak spots or sensitive spots in all the German people. The first one was that Germany had lost World War I. And Germany, of course, like all nations in those days, were proud people. Nationalism was at its height. They were proud people, proud that they were Germans. They were proud in their abilities as a nation to organize armies and fight wars, which were part of life in those days. So it was a tremendous blow to their spirit that Germany was defeated. That was point one. So, developing from that, Hitler and Goebbels developed this concept of the German people being a master race. That they were the race intended to rule the whole world. I mean, it sounds like a sort of fairy story when we talk about it now. But the fact was that these people hoodwinked a whole nation of people into believing that perhaps this was true. Perhaps they were supposed to rule the whole world. It played on their egos, in other words, and on their pride. And the third point was the excuse which Goebbels made for the defeat of Germany in World War I was the machinations of the Jewish people, the German Jewish people. That the German Jewish people, who it is true controlled a lot of the business and heavy industry in Germany at that time, that they were the ones ultimately, through their corruption and all sorts of other stories that were made, were responsible for the downfall of Germany in the 1914-18 war. Well, the fact is that it worked. This combination of a charismatic leader, which Adolf Hitler certainly was, he had an extraordinary magnetism. Goodness knows why we all in those days used to laugh at him, because he looked like Charlie Chaplin with a little moustache. But in fact, to the German people, he was like a magnet. Great speaker and this magnetic personality. And this combination of this leader with this personality, plus the brilliance of propaganda, using the media, the mass media, as directed by Goebbels, brought about the growth and achievements of the Nazi race, or the Nazi party. So this is one of the extraordinary phenomena, I'm sure, of this era of the 20th century, when history looks back on it. So today, I think it's very sad when you talk to German people of my generation, they're so totally bemused by the way they behave. They find it difficult to talk about. People find it unbelievable now that in those days, 40 years ago, living, say, in a village or town within a few miles of a concentration camp, knowing that the concentration camp was there, having a pretty good idea, if not a very accurate idea, of what was going on in that concentration camp. Yet they let it go on. They felt powerless to do anything about it. And in some way, therefore, one has to face the fact that they condoned it. Such is the human mind, so vulnerable to clever talk. And of course, combined with fear. But deep down, somewhere or other, perhaps the belief that maybe this was Germany's destiny to rule the world. That's unbelievable now. And of course, for the younger people in Germany today, it's impossible for them to understand how such a situation could have arisen, though there may be a small minority who secretly take pride in it. So through this, they achieved the unity of the German people through this propaganda and their readiness to fight the world. And, of course, as I said, their readiness to condone the obliteration of the Jewish people. In Japan, too, and it's good to take these more recent examples, though there are plenty more in history, even before modern communications were invented. But in Japan, a similar situation. We read about it, don't we, in the book of the Human Revolution, written by Sensei. You remember how in Japan, the militaristic authorities at the times whipped up the spirit of the people through trying to revive and successfully reviving Shintoism, and in particular, the worship of the emperor, that the emperor was a god. And all the trappings which surrounded that poor man, caught as he was in this net of power-seeking people, and this man had to live as if he was a god. Rarely seen. Wherever he moved, people were not allowed to even look at him. They had to turn their backs on him. And you remember in the very first book of the Human Revolution, Mr. Toda, traveling in a train for the first time after he was released from prison. The train went by the national Shinto shrine, the most important shrine from the point of view of Shinto in Japan, and also the burial place for all the emperors. And everyone stood up in the carriage as the train went past this shrine and bowed to it. And Mr. Toda, it sort of jolted him again as the appalling situation which had arisen in Japan, where people were kowtowing in that way. So if it's not diverting too much, I don't think it is. I was telling the young men earlier on this afternoon about my wife Mitsuko's experience during World War II, because it also has a bearing on the effect of propaganda, the use of the mass media on the people. Because what the mass media of Japan put across all the time was that Western people were nothing else but barbarians, like animals. They had no refinements, though they had all sorts of modern inventions. They were devils in disguise. And the papers were always filled with stories on that sort of line, and with cartoons, people like Churchill and so on, and Roosevelt looking as if they were wolves or what's the other, hyenas, that sort of thing. Well, of course, it's sort of difficult, again, to believe today, but the fact is the Japanese people believed that, because that propaganda went on and on and on, month in, month out, day in, day out, always bringing forth the worst possible stories they could think about. They could think up of the American, British, so on, people. So Mitsuko's family, who lived in a town or a city next to Fukuoka, which is the capital city of the southern island of Japan, in Kyushu Island. When war broke out, her father decided the family should move out of the city, which was also a military headquarters, and live in the country. So they bought a small house in a country village, and there they stayed for the war. And as the war situation worsened from the point of view of the Japanese, and it became more and more apparent that it was likely that the Allies, who were getting nearer and nearer in their island hopping campaign through the Pacific, couldn't be stopped. And especially after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that inevitably they were going to land. And of course, because of this propaganda about the nature of the Western people, to the Japanese at that time, it must have been almost similar to the times of Nichiren Daishonin, when the Japanese people were terrified that the Mongolian hordes, the barbarians from Mongolia, were going to invade Japan. The same sort of terror began to grow in people's hearts. And in the village where Mitsuko lived, all the people began to build shelters in the mountains. And their plan was that if the Allied forces made a landing, they would all flee to the mountains and hide there until the situation became clearer. That's to say, all except Mitsuko's father. He must have been quite a remarkable man. I never knew him because he died about 15 years ago. More than 15, 20 years ago now, before I married Mitsuko. So father said, no, we stay here. Never mind what anyone else wants to do. We stay here. And when the family sort of pleaded with him to allow them to run to the mountains too, father stuck his ground. And he said the Americans and the British, the Australians are human beings. We're human beings too. Therefore, he said, I don't believe the stories being said. And we'll stay our ground and we'll try to make friends with them when they come. Well, this is an extraordinary situation right in the country, miles from anywhere this village is. And everything after the news that the Allies had landed was absolutely silent. The people all fled from the village, disappeared completely. And there was Mitsuko and her family. She was still a young girl in this house, the only ones there. And for several days, nothing happened, just silence. But of course, on the radio, there were the reports that the landing was proceeding and that people should safeguard their lives and all the rest of it. Anyway, I think it was after about the 5th day after the Allies landed, that morning, they suddenly heard the noise of an engine. They'd heard nothing up till then, not even a vehicle. Everyone had gone. And this noise, this engine, came closer and closer and closer. Well, their father took all the precautions necessary to safeguard the family. So he had already built shutters, strong shutters that could be put in all the windows and ways of bolting and barring the doors and so on. So all this was done. And this noise got closer and closer. And Mitsuko says, the children were absolutely petrified. And mother too. But anyway, they huddled together and they just obeyed their father. And their father said, when this vehicle, whatever it is, arrives, I shall go out to meet them. And they implored him not to, but he said he would. Anyway, in due course, the vehicle stopped and through a chink in the boarding, father said that it was a jeep. And what is more, it only had 2 people in it. So he took the bars down, opened the door, and bravely went out to meet this monster. Though her father knew that it wasn't a monster, but to Mitsuko and the girl and her sisters and her brother, there were 5 children, they'd also been fed all this propaganda at school. So they visualized a sort of living human bear or something like that. Anyway, he went out, was out for some time, and they were huddled, shivering and shaking in the house. Finally, father came back and said, don't worry, this American is coming into the house. We're bringing a big box with us. So I want you to stand clear and allow us to put the box down in the center of the floor. So they all imagined, what's in it, they said. Father said, I don't know. Mother said, it may be a bomb. You can imagine the panic. Anyway, the American man with signs, he spoke no Japanese. Mitsuko's father spoke no English. He signaled to him to help him. He wanted to leave this box, and he had asked Mitsuko's father to look after it until he came back in 2 or 3 days' time. So they carried this great chest planted in the middle of the floor. And then the American went on, said he'd be back. And the few days passed, And of course, they were petrified of this box. They really thought it had explosives in it of some sort, or something really horrible to do with these barbarians, you see, from the West. And finally, in 2 or 3 days' time, exactly as promised, the American turned up again. Still, all the villagers were away in the mountains somewhere. Still, Misko's family was entirely alone. And he came in, talked to the father, and then he went out and looked around the village, just checking whether anyone else was there or not, and they weren't. So he turned to father and said, okay, the box is yours. So still they were worried. Anyway, he said, the box is yours and everything in it. Got into his jeep and drove off. And it took, Misko says, hours for anyone, including father, to actually take the funds and open this box. However, finally, father said he would do it, and they all sort of stood back. And he opened the box, and it was full of candies, chocolate, sweets of every sort and size. And the American had brought this box of sweets to be able to give to the villagers, you see, and to show that they didn't intend to harm or hurt anyone. And so the story goes that by the time the villagers crept back from the mountain, about a week later, the box was empty. Anyway, it's a little sort of story, but it does illustrate, again, the power of the mass media, doesn't it? The incredible effect on people which it can have. Little did Mitsuko know at that time that she was going to marry one of the barbarians. So it raises this problem, doesn't it? Which is, in a sense, an eternal problem so far of how to avoid the press or the media distorting the minds of the people. This is the basic problem. There are other subtle influences which Dr. Toynbee mentions in his talks with Sensei. He points out the great danger of mass media in relation to illiterate peoples. They are particularly vulnerable in a sense, even though the mass media may be doing their utmost to present a fair view. If the people are illiterate and can only listen and not write or read, then the rest of the people who are not listening to the radio broadcast must pass the information on, mustn't they, by word of mouth. And we all know that word of mouth can distort things almost unthinkingly. We even find in NSUK sometimes messages are passed by word of mouth, and by the time it gets down the pipeline, it's coming out in a totally different way. And in particular, often we find in NSUK that bold statements are made, like Richmond says you should do this, with no explanation of the reason why. And that is actually never the case. We always go to the greatest pains to explain the reason why everything is proposed. But that's the way it gets to the people. So I can understand there that even if, in terms of the mass media, the people directing it are honest and truly wish to express a fair opinion, in the case of illiterate people, more primitive people in the underdeveloped countries, it can still lead to great distortions. There were many such cases, for example, in India at the time of independence. Have you all seen, or have any of you seen the film Gandhi? Well, at that time, and at that time, as you know, the Hindus and the Muslims spent weeks and weeks and months doing nothing else but massacre each other. I think I talked about it in an earlier lecture. But this was often through misinformation being passed on by people who were illiterate. For instance, an illiterate person who couldn't read and write heard on the radio that in village X, the Hindus had slaughtered all the Muslim families, men, women, and children alike. So immediately they heard that news, which may have been totally inaccurate. It could have been perhaps one person being stoned. But it came through in the end as just mass slaughter. And so the people of the village who received that message took up their axes and their pitchforks and their primitive swords and whatever else weapons they had and marched towards the next village, which happened to be a Muslim village, and slaughtered them. This sort of thing went on all the time, I know for a fact. And of course, the killing, as I said earlier, I think to you in that lecture a few months ago, people say that 3 million, something between 1.5 and 3 million people were killed in the Hindu-Muslim troubles. But in fact, in truth, the governments of those days knew that it was round about 5 to 6 million people slaughtered. And one of the problems certainly was mass communications often not being understood. So then the other subtle influence in the case of the media can be government pressure. Government pressure to get them to do what the government wants them to do. And this, of course, could be done violently, but in a democracy it never would be done violently, but it can be done by indirect, covered-up means. For example, by threatening to foreclose on any pay rises, salary rises for some trumped-up reason or another. Or the threat indirectly spread, even by rumor, that various important people on the staff are going to be dismissed. They're going to get the sack. This shakes people. It's their livelihood and so on. And through such indirect means, they can begin to influence, pressurize the BBC or any other mass media form to do what they want, to say what they want. So in fact, of course, the BBC has a great reputation. There can be no doubt about that. Throughout the world, the BBC World Service is hugely respected for being the most honest, accurate, well-balanced reporting on world affairs. And I think, too, that they are amazingly good. I think that there were one or two little hiccups. Mainly, their reporting of the Falklands War, for example, was a case where they bent over backwards to try to give a fair picture of both sides. And the government was upset, if you remember, at that time. They accused the BBC of being against, but in fact, the BBC were being, I think, as fair and as just in their reporting as they could honestly be. And one wouldn't have missed those, what do you call the program? I forget it, on BBC Two. Those sort of 45 minutes or so of reporting at the time of the Falklands War. What? No, well, Panorama was one. What's the one every night at BBC Two? Newsnight. It was fantastic. On the other hand, the BBC, on one or two instances, appear to have bent a bit recently. There was the one about the IRA interviews, and one or two other programs about Northern Ireland were not put on under government pressure. This is a worry. And all governments tried. It's not just, restricted to the Conservative Party. Socialists tried it, and I'm sure if the SDP or the Liberals ever come together, they'll try it. So another form or way in which the mass media, this is in terms of television, can be bent is through commercialization. Because if a television station is commercialized and is advertising, there will always be pressure from those who are spending money on that advertising, which is the income of the television company, to put on sensational programs when their particular advertisement is on. And indeed, they attract people to those peak periods of viewing through such sensational programs. So in those cases, of course, they may show films which are not necessarily dangerous from a political point of view, but from a moral point of view, because they'll go for sensationalism at those particular times in order to attract the business of advertising. Also, we know there's a tendency to, it seems sometimes, glorify war through overshowing or a bad selection of old films, which were in fact propaganda films. They were the use of the mass media to create a spirit of victory or of the great cause of war or the glory of war, actually made in those times, in World War II. We see them from time to time. Films that make me curl up because I remember them so well. Films that, show pictures of the Union Jack, which is one of the reasons why I came to feel embarrassed at the sight of the Union Jack. Now, of course, I'm changing because through Sensei's poem, we know that we have to create a totally new image which the Union Jack represents. And then finally, of course, there is the problem of violence. This is a topical subject, and apparently there is already an investigation beginning into the actual effect of violence on television screens consistently on certain types of people. Not everybody, of course, but on certain types of people that it can bring out that violence in them and have a deteriorating effect on such people. So there are all sorts of subtle views. There are more probably than I've mentioned, but those are the main ones. So how can we establish the absolute neutrality of the media? Because it's essential, isn't it, if you think about it, if democracy is to really work. Without that, it's very difficult to steer a true democracy. Because the democracy is based on the concept of the people having all the facts and making their own decisions. So if the facts are distorted, the whole thing is destroyed. And this is a problem, and it doesn't occur yet. The BBC is sponsored by the government and funded by the government. We've already heard the weaknesses of commercial television. I'm not saying commercial television is wrong, but what I'm saying is it's not the right place to expect to get really accurate reporting. But the BBC should be, and that is the purpose that it isn't commercialized. So it's a question of money in the end, of course. If the money is controlled by the political party in power of that particular time, then it's open to distortion, open to pressure. So the only way, since Toynbee feel this can be done, is always such a thing will require government sponsoring, but by law, the body which controls the money should be a totally independent body in concern, not related to the government of the day, but legally an independent body of selected people, representative people who control the funds. So, of course, if such a law was passed and then such a law was protected, and I think it would be if the people of this country just understood what the whole problem is, then they would be willing to protect that freedom of the BBC with their lives. Because I think most people really understand what a danger the mass media can be in the wrong hands. So another point which Sensei mentioned was the fact that people must be left to make their own decisions. If they don't have that freedom to make their own decisions, then it saps their life force and they become weak and, in Mrs. Thatcher's term, wet, don't they? This is very important. Even in the Gosho, we know Nichiren Daishonin's condemnation of the Nembutsu was that it bred the philosophy amongst the ordinary people that there was nothing they could do about this life. They'd got to accept it, but if they chanted Namamita Butsu, they'd go to paradise after they died. So Nichiren Daishonin condemned this because it was stultifying the minds of the people, preventing them from using or galvanizing their life force in order to face situations and make decisions about the right way to deal with them. In a sense, of course, such apathy could be and is very easy to control. And this is why evil governments could sap the life force of the people in this way in order to control them. And there have been cases in history where that's happened. The mass media must, if it's true and correct, protect the right of the people to make the decisions and provide the people with the facts in order to do so. So interestingly enough, Sensei feels so strongly on the right and freedom of the people to make their own choice as a Buddhist, that he says even in the case of pornography, it should never be banned. If you ban anything, people will want to get hold of it. Rather, leave it. Don't restrict it, except to protect it from children. And so far as adults are concerned, leave it to them to get sick of it in the end and stop buying it. And of course, he's right. So this is the Buddhist view throughout this matter of the mass media, that the freedom of the people to make their own choice and their own decisions must be protected. You all follow. The freedom, in other words, the fundamental dignity of the human being to make his or her own decisions. So how to establish such respect for life, such respect for the dignity of life in the people and in governments, they have to reach the conclusion, Toynbee Sensei, in the end, that it can only be through true or correct religion. That really is the only way in the end that you can get people thinking in that way and overcoming what are probably long-held distorted views. Then, of course, if that happened, and if the correct religion, and we know what is the correct religion, if that spreads, then the people will be demanding very positive reporting, not negative reporting. What we see so much in the newspapers, especially the tabloids, is negative reporting, sensational reporting, which is always negative and often even destructive. And this is why, when you think about it, the UK Express is such an amazing little publication. It's only a tiny publication. It has a very small circle of people who receive it in compared to the population of the country. But it's a unique publication, completely, because it is entirely devoted to the positive aspect of life, to confidence in the future, to courage and so on. And people like it. People like it, don't they? Not just members. So two famous Japanese ladies in Scotland, Mrs. Porteous, who's now a chapter leader, and Mrs. McKinnon, who is a district leader. And these two Japanese ladies, I don't know for how many years, have always bought, I don't know whether they still do, but for years and years and years, they used to buy between them 100 copies of the UK Express. Always. Every month without fail. And then they would distribute these UK Expresses to the butcher, the baker, candlestick maker, to their neighbours, pop them through their letterboxes. Then one month, I can't remember the reason for it, perhaps the UK Express never arrived and these people never got their UK Express. Mrs. Porter said everyone was ringing her up. These people who had received this and had read it for so long saying, Where's that wonderful magazine that you're always putting through my door? I haven't had it. Has something happened? Has it gone out of print? Or they were so worried and wanted it, to see it so much. So it just shows what an effect that little magazine has on people. I'm sure you all have experiences of non-members finding it. very attractive and very inspiring. And this is missing from the press, isn't it? So I wonder, how many of you here, are any of you here involved in the mass media? Can you hold up your hands? Oh, wow, lots. I said this to the young men's division, and there was no one amongst them at all in it, strangely enough. Can you hold your hands up again? That's wonderful. Great. Because this is the solution, isn't it? In other words, as the years unfold ahead, we want lots of members working in amongst the mass media, because inevitably then, gradually, it'll be a gradual process, no forcing of it, but gradually, the wisdom of the Gohans will be reflected from each one of you. You might find it hard to believe, but it naturally will. The way you talk to other journalists over a coffee, or the way you may make a suggestion even to your manager or your director, will have something quite new in it, a new dimension, which other people haven't thought about before. Or if they've thought about it, they've dismissed it. But the way you put it across will have the power of the Gonzen behind it. And therefore, through that, gradually, over the years, you can bring about great change. So I'm thrilled that there are so many of you involved in the mass media. The more the merrier. We need Shakabuku people in the mass media, and also, of course, other people who've been Shakabuku we want in the mass media, so that they can bring the wisdom of the Buddha to bear. Then we can gradually bring about incredible changes. That's for sure. So as Kosen Rufu and its movement grows, so also inevitably such social reforms will gradually come about. At the moment, people can't see it. Their eyes are blind. So we'll stop now for the usual coffee and start again in about 15 minutes. Okay? Thank you very much.